So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services. We'll define then the scripture from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, giving then the understanding of the time of the end. So then we can properly update the scripture, because we have found then we were then given scoundrelized the scripture, and then part of it was then the ignorance of the translators. So lots of situations going on, because truly the scriptures then were scoundrelized. We find the column of salt regarding then Lot's wife. It was a lie. There was no column of salt. Column of salt came from the Roman legions when they were in the northern part of Africa, and they used to get paid with salt. Salt was then made as columns, and those were then paid as rations and then tribute to the Roman legions. So it gives you the understanding then, when the situation in Rome was very scoundrelized, in speaking of then the economy and then people and then the social situation of the time, they began to translate the holy manuscripts, and then they used the government of the time. You must make a proper distinction. It was the government of the time when the scripture was translated. It has nothing to do with what we experience today. So we have to give a slack and not blame only because those people who made a mistake back then, it continue on, and then granted, a lot of people today don't even know it. It's a simple fact of updating what then we find out as we discover. So then let's not be judgmental, but then understand there is an objective, updating of the scripture. Because those were not columns of salt, those were then rations paid, and then we understand this factor. However, we have also then Cornelius. He was then a centurion. He never had a vision or a dream. But because of the title, then they made him important, stating he had some sort of a vision or dream. It's not true. Later then, those people during the time of the government of the past decided then to scoundrelize the scripture, to manipulate the people. But then today we have discovered those, and only because the situation is related with the time of restoration. The only reason why we must update those scriptures is because it's time of restoration. That's what it means. After 2009, we understand it comes a time of restoration and reduction of time. So we must update those. We don't have any other option other than updating the scripture, or then those congregations are going to be simply non-existent. Because then the whole understanding of then those congregations are then congregations of testifiers of the Messiah. So then we understand what's coming in the future. So then, based then from the original manuscripts as they are, then we establish then first a scripture coming from the first son of Ibrahim, the Quran. We understand the Quran. Then comes the second son. Second son came much later. Then we understand the lineage of Yitzhak. Then we simply update those scripture. And then we understand the first holy city in the land of Cush. From then on, then we understand Zechariah, and then other cities coming around, and then the rest of those people who do believe there is a Messiah, then they are simply testifiers of the Messiah. But then we understand there are no gifts of the Spirit, and then they have to update themselves to become testifiers of the Messiah, or then Goliars. Gola means then revelation, revealing. So then when we read then on the 6th chapter, those testifying on favor of the Messiah, those are doing the testifying. So then truly the updating is very important, but then the transition is somewhat not complicated, because we understand the sons of Ishmael, they're going to become very important in the future. They're going to establish the relationship of worldwide trade from nation to nation, those very relevant events from nation to nation. They are going to be involved because it is the first son of Ibrahim, and they are then the leaders of these because we are restoring. When you hear the word restoring, means whatsoever the Creator was involved with must be done, and He recognizes then the birthright. So then, whatsoever comes after, we have to deal with it, because then comes the great undertaking of updating the Scripture. Whatsoever then was given to us, most of it was scoundrelized. We were teaching lies for so long, Bible study junkies, and then we preaching to people, then, the people of the Israelic lineage came out of Egypt after so many plagues. There were no plagues. We were liars. These pastors, teachers, and evangelists, they lied the entire time. Granted, they did not understand the Scripture, though they are liars. It doesn't take away the fact that they lied. There were no major miracles in Egypt, and then Moshe simply had visions of what then Pharaoh would have. Obviously, Moshe had each of the visions the Pharaoh had prior of visiting with him, because he knew then what's coming. And then the obvious situation is, how can you muster an army to go after then the cheap slaves on the desert if the country then is ruined? So then gives you the understanding, if you read from the Quran, you understand that it was a spiritual understanding. So then our country had repleted with pastors, teachers, and evangelists then teaching lies. They were liars. They don't know what they're talking about. So an update of the Scripture is absolutely must, and these liars over there, they must stop for some time until the Scripture is updated, so then they can resume their duties. Because people are not going to be paying organizations so they can be lied on their faces. If we do this as Americans, then we are stupid, because we have not built our nation with such an industry might, and then in our leisure time going around giving money to scoundrels to lie at our faces. It's not part of our understanding. That was then many years ago American standard, because we knew how to do. We knew industry. And we have credited this favor upon us as God doing His work. But as the normal factor of life, we then understand, as we discover more situations, more translations are coming up purely and understandably, we have to update ourselves. And the Bible or Scripture is no document that should not be then disregarded, because we should be regarding the Scripture very important. Yet we should update the Scripture and then move on from there as testifiers of the Messiah. So then there is a lot of work that must be done. And for us Americans to going around and teaching junk, it's not part of our culture. This country was the absolutely best during the time of the industry, and the world has learned with it, and we have credited to God what we have learned. And we should not lie regarding Scripture. We understand there are many scandalizations. Truly, the Scripture is a scandal. And then the Israelic people then coming out of Egypt, and Egypt then going through 10 plagues, never existed, and then going to the desert, then column of fire never existed on the desert, separating the Egyptians then from the Hebrews, and then those were lies. And then lamb being slain, and then, taking the dam and places on the front of their shacks. How could they do this if the Pharaoh had only a dream? He had a vision. So there was no ritual, no slaughtering of any lamb and then placed on the front of the shacks. So we're a nation then going around the world teaching crap. We didn't understand because it was handed down lies and scandalizations. So we have the obligation then of absolutely update the Scripture and then going around the world again testifying properly because we were handed down junk. And give God what belongs to Him. So then, from this viewpoint, we conclude that then those people of the Israelic lineage came out of Egypt, roughly 600,000 people, because we must understand this. Pharaoh was not stupid. Pharaoh was very wise. And what had made him make a decision of let the people go were only those enlightened. Moshe then, after the order of Pharaoh simply said to him, go over there amongst the people of your own, speak what you have, and then those wanting to go with you, they should. Those not wanting to go with you should stay. However, Moshe had only visions because he was in many times having dreams. And during those dreams he had visions of the Spirit. Then you begin to understand. Some people were enlightened, some people were not. And there were no 10 plagues upon Egypt. Those enlightened, they went out of Egypt, and Pharaoh simply said, take what is required for the journey. There was no plundering. God had placed in them, give this person what is required for the journey. And then obviously Moshe went out, he spoke, some of the people then were on his side and they went out of Egypt. Later then, Pharaoh realized he was then deceived. It's not that he was not deceived, he was deceived. Because as he had only dreams, he then realized he exchanged a set of dreams, very real, for roughly 600,000 people. He did understand later he made a bargain in exchange for some dreams. That's why then he had mustered an army, he went after them because he wanted to have his slaves back. 600 people had a lot of people to, build bricks and more buildings and expand in Egypt. He went after the slaves. But then he went so far, he went then to a certain extent after going the sea, and then they got stuck in the sand. can easily understand. The wind had come. The wind had come and swept away then the ocean for some time. So when the people came out of Egypt, the place was already ready for them. There was no stretch out your hand. Those were sorcerers they used to do. When the people came out of Egypt, they came straight through. So not the sea had then parted. It had receded. Came a wind, the sea then receded, and then people went to the other side. Then came Pharaoh and his army, went up to a certain extent, then it was desert. People were already gone. Couldn't find them. By the time he came back, he got stuck in the sand. As they tried to return to Egypt, then they were drowned. So what is this junk then speaking? Oh, stretch out your hand. Those were sorcerers of the time. That's why there were so many people then destroyed. So then you must understand what it meant and go from there and take away the mysticism from. There was no stretch out your hand. Stretch out your hand for what reason? The set of visions were given. Then whatsoever Pharaoh had to know, he did. And there was no reason to show any other type of force. That was it. And then you find, try to ride a horse when then the sand is very wet. What does it take place? They break their legs. Because horses have so much power in them. That's how we measure then our own engines. Horsepower. As they got stuck, they broke themselves. And then they went on in their journey. But then came a time where then they didn't have water. They began to complain. And then it came a point where then simply the people had got tired of it and cursed Moses, and then came back to Egypt. They tried to return to Egypt, and they got lost in the desert. So this situation, people then had sandals that were never worn out. Those were the rocks. There was a time over there they went around in the desert, they kind of, chisel around the sandals picture, or then the saddle form. So the sandals on the rocks would never wear away, obviously. And then 40 years walking in the desert, there was no such. 40 years had taken them to get the establishment of the first tabernacle service prior of receiving the promised land. So we were taught lies for a long time. And we Americans, when we perceived that we were deceived, we get sometimes very high temper. Because we for so long had protected a nation, and we received the junk in exchange. So then, as then Ronald had found then the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant was at, and the utensils, Now comes the very important task of updating the scripture. And then, if it was an American archaeologist that found then the first holy objects, it doesn't take much to understand who is going to be then the person doing the updating of the scripture. We Americans had to come up with the entire scripture updated. So let's get used to it. Because we won't anymore going around teaching junk around the world. We won't be spending our leisure time in congregations and pastors and teachers and scoundrels and liars teaching lies to your kids. Because you can do this much yourself. You don't have to go then anymore any day of the time of your leisure to listen to lies and scoundrels, always giving you then behavioral procedures or then damnation. Know yourself then the truth. So we have to update the scripture as any other factor in the planet. You update your car, you update your computer, sometimes you update your relationship. Shouldn't, but you know. And then sometimes we have scripture that are not true, and then we must update it. And then the rest of the religions around the world, they become testifiers. They can't claim any kind of endowment of power from any kind of a heaven or inferno or any other place. They are not from the Israelic lineage, most of them. They do only the testifying for the Messiah, only the galaying or the unveiling. There are no prophets outside of the holy tabernacles. Whosoever claims to be a prophet, any kind of a religious activist, then a person is crazy, simply has a familiar spirit. The title doesn't fit. There are no prophets outside of the Holy of Holies, neither of the holy cities. 7 spirits of Elohim, 7 functions given to those of the Israelic lineage only. Or those would be invited by Ruach HaKodesh in the holy cities and then have to be trained. The rest of us, testifiers. If we like it or not, that's another point. But we must update the scripture if we want to be on top, as we used to be in the past. Mostly because of our industry, because we thought then religion was junk. But then we are very grateful that Ronald found, he was then an archaeologist from USA, and he found the holy objects. So let's move forward then and update the scripture. It's only proper for us to do so. And then preparing ourselves then to restructurize our industry, because we can't rely on lies anymore. We already understand the understanding of the Messiah comes from the second son, from the Israelic lineage. We understand then the Ishmaelic lineage, or the Ishmaelites, they have then the forward motion regarding then Gentile level. Because when the time comes, they're going to give the order. Only establish the tabernacle of the desert on a temple mount. There won't be a third temple. There is a reason why that the Muslim shrine or the Dome of the Rock is there where it's at. Those are of the Ishmaelites. Now we understand the plan. We have then to get on with and update the scripture. If we are worth something, if America has become a piece of junk, so be it. It's a piece of junk. But know for sure, without industry, we can't compete with the world. Our forward motion is making sure we update the scripture for what it is. then we have an understanding with the Messiah worldwide. Otherwise, we have no industry, we have no religion, we've got nothing. What are we going to adopt? Islam? Yeah, we could. Should we then use Arabic language then as the second language? Maybe we should. So many areas of updating must come. So please stay tuned.